it's not just the Great Britain. It seems like the other major powers of the world too suffer from the amnesia of the empire. This week, world leaders celebrated the 75th anniversary of the D-Day landings in Normandy. This is a significant event in history. On the 6th of June 1944, the largest ever military operation was launched by 15 countries to free Europe from Nazi occupation. This eventually led to the end of the Second World War. World leaders, royalty and veterans gathered in the UK for this commemoration. But even here, India's contribution was conveniently forgotten. More than 2 million men of undivided India fought the Nazi forces during the Second World War. More than 2 million. Time and again, their contributions have been undermined. India's participation in the war began in 1939 when 4 mule companies were sent off to France. They were instructed to assist the British expeditionary forces. These soldiers, part of the Royal Army, the Royal Indian Army Service Corps, sailed from the then Bombay to Marseille. Britain always depended on its colonies across the world for soldiers and supplies. The then Viceroy of India, Lord Linlithgow, did not consult the Indian freedom fighters about this. He dragged India into the Second World War. Mahatma Gandhi raised his voice. He launched the Quit India movement in 1942 that was brutally crushed by the British Raj. Indian soldiers played a major role in securing supply lines and supporting Allied forces. Behind the scenes, Indian cooks, tailors, mechanics, all of them assisted the Western soldiers. But on the 6th of June this year, the British and their allies yet again failed to remember India's contributions, dismissing it as part of their colonial past. 300 veterans were invited for the commemoration in Portsmouth in the UK. But there was no mention of India. In fact, the British do not like to mention the Indian contribution. They instead used the word Commonwealth to remember the fallen heroes from South Asia. The contributions of the Indian soldiers do not figure in any popular narrative of both the world wars. A prominent example of that is Dunkirk, the 2017 film. It depicted the evacuation of Allied soldiers from the north of France during the Second World War. This movie conveys a single narrative, that Britain stood alone during the battle against the Nazis and somehow managed to pull off a miracle. That was not the case. The fact is that Indian soldiers fought at Dunkirk. Historians claim that at least 3 contingents of the Royal Indian Army Service Corps were evacuated from this region. No mention of them. And this is just one story, by the way. Indian soldiers were dispatched to every theatre of war that the British were involved in, and the Indian soldiers distinguished themselves with their feats of exemplary courage. Here's a look at the role played by India in the Second World War.
From the trenches of Europe to the deserts of North Africa, to the swamps of Southeast Asia, the soldiers of the British Indian Army played a pivotal role. When the war broke out in 1939, the British Indian Army had over 200,000 soldiers in its ranks. By 1945, after taking in volunteers, the British Indian Army numbered a whopping 2.5 million. The largest volunteer fighting force in history. These forces included tank, artillery and airborne forces. In Somalia, Eritrea and Abyssinia, the Indian soldiers were up against Mussolini's forces. Despite being outgunned and short on supplies, they managed to turn the tables on the Axis powers and captured the fortress of Keren. The 4th, 5th and the 10th divisions of the Indian Army blunted the onslaught of Rommel's German Africa Corps and pushed the Nazis back. The Indian soldiers were at the forefront of the battle against Germany in Europe. The 43rd Gorkha Infantry Brigade fought at the Gothic Line and in the grueling Battle of Monte Cassino in 1944 to 1945. They were instrumental in the liberation of Italy from the fascists. In the east, the British Indian Army's Burma campaign reversed the Japanese onslaught. The Indian soldiers managed to break the siege of Kohima, which proved to be a crucial turning point in 1944. Often referred to as the Stalingrad of the East, the Battle of Kohima was one of the bloodiest during the Second World War. In 2013, the British National Army Museum voted the battles of Imphal and Kohima as Britain's greatest battles, surpassing Waterloo and D-Day. though at the time it was overshadowed by the Normandy landings. Another interesting strand of India's participation in the Second World War was through the Indian National Army. Formed first by Mohan Singh Deb and later led by Subhash Chandra Bose, the Indian National Army was composed of prisoners of war taken by Japan from the British Indian Army. Under Subhash Chandra Bose, the INA threw in its lot with Japan to invade and liberate India from the British, with Japanese help. The INA berated British opposition to Nazism and fascism as hypocrisy. It was Britain, argued the INA, which had colonized India, violated human rights, and denied individual liberties. But with the defeat of Japan, almost 17,000 soldiers of the Indian National Army were captured and tried for treason. As a colonized country, India was not in a position to decide its destiny during the Second World War. Indeed, the British dragged India into the war. Underfed and not as well armed, the Indian soldier was often cannon fodder against the Axis forces. But even in such trying circumstances, the courage and bravery of the Indian soldiers shone through in a war which actually was for hegemony between two imperial and colonizing alliances. Bureau Report, Wion, World is One.